this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me on the podcast today is Richard Boyatzis, a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University, as well as a professor in the departments of organizational behavior, psychology, and cognitive science. Richard earned degrees from MIT and Harvard and is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and the Association for Psychological Sciences. He has authored more than 200 articles and 9 books on leadership, emotional intelligence, competency development, neuroscience, and management education, including the international bestseller Primal Leadership with Daniel Goleman and Annie McKee, as well as the recent Helping People Change with Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Osteen. His Coursera MOOCs have over 1 million enrolled. Richard, it is a real pleasure to speak with you today. Let's start off with the most basic definition if we can. What is emotional intelligence?
Emotional intelligence is really a kind of common sense issue. It's how do you handle your emotions? And how do you interact with or handle the emotions of others in your relationships? So if you have more emotional intelligence, it means first that you have to have some ability to be aware of what you're feeling. And I'm not talking about consciously interpreting it. I'm saying, what's the feeling? And then you have to be able to handle it somehow. So it includes characteristics that we would see behaviorally, like emotional self-awareness, emotional self-control. In the work world, it also involves things like achievement orientation. Do you direct your emotions towards doing something better? Do you have a positive outlook? And then you have the other side of it, which is how do you handle the emotions of others? And that really comes in the form of relationships. Again, the behavioral parts of it. Do you demonstrate empathy? Do you seek to understand what other people are feeling, both what they're feeling and why? Do you engage them in a way which leads them to feel some common sense of purpose or vision? Do you tend to be a good member of teams? Those kinds of abilities.
And there's no relationship to IQ involved, right?
Well, it depends on how you define it. I mean, one of the branches of the research on emotional intelligence, that by Jack Mayer and Peter Salovey and David Caruso, contends that it should be highly associated with cognitive intelligence. So in fact, their measure is somewhat related to cognitive intelligence abilities. There are several other branches of the people, of groups of the scholars who study this stuff, and the other groups end up pretty much saying, no, it really should be independent of general mental ability, IQ, those kinds of things. Then you also have the issue, well, is it a personality trait? And again, one of the other schools of thought, like championed by Reuven Bar-On, who end up having their approach and even their measures more correlated, often because they use self-assessment. I'm a part of a third group which looks at it in terms of the behavior. In other words, what would somebody see or feel in interacting with you? And I don't deny the fact that all of these things are emotional intelligence. There are different aspects of it, different levels within the hierarchy. In fact, in terms of some of my research on the neuroimaging, you can even get down to the neural activation levels. But the part of it that most of us access, our normal people at work and at home, ends up being the behavior parts.
Right. I know I saw in the index of Primal Leadership, it talked about once you get to senior level, everybody's IQ is about the same band. And what really separates the ones who continue on in growth, there really is the emotional intelligence they have.
Well, that's right. I mean, the fact is that I remember Dan Goleman used to do this thing where he'd ask his audiences, whether there were a few hundred or a few thousand people, how many of them were valedictorians of their high school class, when you get 1 or 2 hands raised. And then he'd say, how many of you have done better in life or in work than the valedictorian of your class, and almost everybody raises their hand. So, and I got to say, I spent more time with people that were members of Mensa, which are IQs of 160 or above, when I was treating alcoholics and drug addicts as a therapist in most of the 70s. So the fact is that being a very highly cognitively smart, often, I mean, you can make great contributions, but you could also end up having difficulties in life. You come across like Sheldon,
exactly,
on Big Bang Theory, and when I worked as an aerospace research scientist for 6.5 months to be able to make enough money to get myself through finished MIT. One of the things that was always amazing is we had 2 departments in this research group, and it was like hanging around with a whole group of Sheldons, which meant the conversations were a little weird. As I think back to it. Now, of course, my wife says I'm just like that. Maybe not as extreme as Sheldon, but yes. So very high IQ. Now, here's a very important issue. I've actually published research showing that some of the most effective people, senior partners at major accounting, consulting firms, executives, show a high degree of emotional intelligence competencies or behavior, show a relatively high degree compared to others of social intelligence and of cognitive intelligence. So the interesting issue is no one of these is more important than the others. They're all important. But as you say, usually by the time people get to a certain level in organizations, I mean, most people in executive ranks and professional roles are in that IQ range of 120 to 130, 135. So when you're dealing with that restricted range, then what makes a difference is the people who bring these other capabilities.
Now, you mentioned social intelligence. What is that about?
That's really, Dan Goleman and I divide up these competencies into the ones that are about the self, managing your own emotions, versus the ones that have to do, not versus, but, and social intelligence are those competencies about handling emotions in your relationships with others.
Okay. Now we use leader a lot, and one of my previous guests was, he has a big point of semantics between leaders and managers. So for your purpose, how do you define leaders? Because in the book, it says that there are many leaders, not just one, and leadership can be distributed. So how do we define leadership in that vein?
First, let me tell you that I think there are a lot of people who try to make a distinction between leaders and managers because, it's pop psych. So I mean, you're not quite old enough to remember this, but in the 50s, everybody wanted to be an administrator. Then you got into the 60s, especially the late 60s and into the 70s, people said, oh no, administrators, they're dull and boring. I want to be a manager. And, then you got into the late 70s and into the 80s, and people said, managers are so bureaucratic and all they think about is control issues. I want to be a leader. Then by the late 90s, people said, leaders can be so manipulative and tools of the man. We want to be transformational leaders, and it goes on and on and on. So let me take that rhetoric outside of this conversation.
Okay, great.
Most people in leadership positions are managers.
Right.
Now, do they see themselves as leaders or managers? So if you're talking about your self-perception or your self-talk, I think that you're better off if you can cross over. It's not as humble, because there's some people say, hey, I'm just a manager out of humility. But the fact is that our research continues to show, since the first study I did in 1970, that people who are effective managers and people who are effective leaders use the same behavior. Okay. Now, the reason I have to say that is, again, I've been a part of thousands of these studies and have colleagues and students all over the world. We've done it in 140 countries, these competency studies against performance. And what it says is a shocking, kind of really humbling statistic that 70 to 80% of the people in leadership or management positions aren't adding much value. The organization could do better if you took them out of that role. I mean, maybe keep them in the company or the agency, but take them out of that role, and the organization would function more smoothly. So one of the issues is being an effective leader or an effective manager is the real distinction you're after, not to just be a leader or a manager. All that said, I think to define the role of an effective leader is somebody who is able to leverage the 5 forms of capital at the disposal of a person in such a position to get current performance and build the capital, all 5 forms, at the end of the performance period. The 5 forms of capital are financial, physical, intellectual, human, and social.
Okay. Well, when you said that 70-80% of the managers aren't adding value, I bet 100% of the people listening went, oh, yeah, I know who that is.
Yeah. Well, first of all, everybody knows this because it's so clear. But the other is, and nobody thinks they're in that group.
Exactly.
It's like Lake Wobegon, Harrison Keeler's, where all the children are above average.
Yeah. So somebody needs to drag down the curve, but it's not mine, right? Now, it looks like there's some neuroscience involved here, and I read that our limbic system is an open loop system. So first of all, what is a limbic system, and what does it matter that it's open loop?
Well, the limbic system is really a description for the parts of the brain that are at the center of the brain. So parts of it is just above your brainstem, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. And at the time that we were writing Primal Leadership, we made a big focus on that, which Dan Goleman had through his conversations with other colleagues about the fact that that's where a lot of the emotional parts of people's experiences emanate from. We now have a much more complex picture, as you would imagine. Here we are 20 some years later. And what we now know is that most of the brain's functioning happens through networks. So those of us like myself who do a lot of neuroscience research don't spend as much time talking about a part of the brain as a network of different parts of the brain. So for example, in the 90s, a lot of people talked about left brain, right brain. Right. Turns out that that's not quite true. That as people really got into the research, there is a left brain and a right brain, but every part of the brain has a left and right component to it, and which part leads to more emotional processing and more analytic processing sometimes flips. So the research has helped us to clarify that it's not quite that simple as the kind of pop psych interpretations. And today, when we talk about these networks, one of my colleagues at Case Western Reserve, Professor Anthony Jack, has done a lot of research looking at what Randy Buckner from Harvard and others had started to talk about in publications in 2005. But now Tony has gone further with a lot of research studies to show that 2 of the many networks in our brain are, one's called the task positive network, which Tony prefers to call the analytic network. It's a clearer name. And the other is the default mode network, which Tony says is really the empathic network. The analytic network is parts of the anterior cingulate cortex back here, parts of the prefrontal cortex. The empathic network is parts of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex behind, kind of deeper in there, posterior cingulate cortex, cingulate, insula. And we need both. We need the analytic network to solve problems, to make decisions, and it helps us focus. We need the empathic network to be open to new ideas, learning, scanning the environment, and to be open to people. So as you and I were talking about before, we're both trained as engineers. We're trained in terms of how to narrow our focus. Well, what happens when you narrow your focus? You don't see what's going on out there. And in fact, one of the dilemmas we have in most organizations is that anything abstract, anything financial, IT, engineering, accounting, gets you into analytic thinking. And if you do that repeatedly, you're not facilitating the going back and forth between these networks.
Okay.
And that means that you actually miss things going on. At the strategy level, it's called competition neglect. I mean, you don't see what your competitors are doing,
Right.
or you don't notice the human being that's offering a point. I mean, there was a magnificent example of this when Deepwater Horizon blew in the Gulf. Because whether you believe, the Mark Wahlberg movie about it, but a friend of mine was on the review panel, the federally endorsed review panel, and he was a colleague from UNC Chapel Hill, and he was saying something that the transcripts from that were published of a lot of the communications in the Wall Street Journal made very clear. The chief engineer started to say to the rig manager in their morning meeting, review meeting or whatever, there are some pieces of rubber coming up from the bottom. We should stop the pump and send divers down and check it out. And the head of the rig said, no, we never stop the pump, just keep going. Well, 3 days in a row, he said this, not in the movie, but in reality, 3 days in a row. And finally, the head of the rig said, let me call Houston and see what they think. So he calls Houston after their meeting. Houston talks about it that day, and they decide to call headquarters in London. Time change. So the next morning, people in London are kind of talking about it, and they think about it, and then they come up with a conclusion, a position, and they get back to Houston, who then thinks about it and talks about it and then gets back to the rig manager. In the process, the thing blew. And they could have avoided all of it if they had stopped the pumps, gone down, and realized that something was off kilter and it was knocking out the rubber, not there weren't gaskets, but the cushions, the collars that they had, and they could have actually saved that thing.
Wow.
All because the rig manager was in analytic engineering mode. This is what we do. And we are told to never stop the pumps.
And they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I had another example of, a few of my MBA students, part-time evening students in the 90s worked for a U.S. automotive company. I don't want to say the name, but they were saying that, they had this experience. They were on a night shift when one of the people toward the end of the production loop yells out from the pit, hey, the engine isn't bolted. The engines are mounted onto the body of the car. And it turned out in this particular model, there were 4 main bolts that the engine was put on, and then they would be, screwed down. Well, nobody had put the nuts on them. They just put it on the bolts. So the supervisor, not this guy, but he said the supervisor said the usual thing they were taught to always do. Keep the line moving. And he yells to the guy in the pit and says, don't worry, they'll pick it up in after work. Well, I pity the poor sucker who got that car, because chances are they didn't pick it up in after work.
No, first bump. Here comes the engine.
So that's an example of how you can take an analytic approach, which is, of course, necessary. But if you exclusively do it, that's why I've said for decades, show me somebody who opens meetings with financials and I'll show you an ineffective leader. It's not because they're not important. Of course they are. I've built and run companies. For 11 years, I was CEO of one company with a few hundred people and a chief operating officer another with another 100 or so. And I, bought and sold companies. So I understand all that. But the fact is that when you open a meeting with financials, it says to everyone in the group 2 things. One, the only important issue here are financials, not our customers, not our products, not our services, not how, we're trying to be of service. Secondly, it gets everybody into the analytic mode. So you've literally narrowed their field of vision. What the challenge is, and this is why leadership and management, I think, is so difficult. You don't manage a task. You don't manage a strategic plan. You don't even manage a budget. So one of my friends, John Cotter, used to say in his some of his management books in the 80s, he said, chances are if you're in a leadership position, you're managing people at another level, who are 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 actually managing people who really do the work.
Right.
So you're maybe 6 levels, or maybe at the minimum 3 levels away from the actual work. So what's your job? Well, your job is to motivate, if not inspire, the people at these levels to do the same thing to the people below them. So it's a very human-centric role. And too many people still think the primary purpose of leaders or managers are to manage budgets and numbers. That's part of the job.
Right.
Turns out it's not the most important or the most leverageable part of the job.
Now, I was talking about people. I was really fascinated to read about this concept of mirroring and how the group, almost like the group think, happens with based on one or two people. If they're strong-willed, how their mentality or their demeanor can actually influence the whole group.
Well, actually, in the neuroscience in the last 15 years has become even more precise on that. For a long time, people talked, especially in the 90s, about the mirror neuron network in the brain, which is an important network because this is the one that's very closely aligned with your motor neuron network. So it helps you with motion, breathing. But the mirror neuron network, people used to think was central to empathy. It kind of is, but it really isn't. It is central to behavioral mimicry. So when somebody, if you're in a face-to-face meeting, it's pre-COVID thing that we used to have called meetings, and somebody yawns, somebody else will yawn. And it's not because they need oxygen. It's because of this behavioral mimicry. If you fold your arms, somebody else that you're with will fold their arms.
Right.
That is facilitated by the mirror neuron network. But the desire to understand another person, what we really think of as the key part of empathy, really is this empathic network I was talking about. It's a different network in the brain. All of them are needed. And what you're speaking about, though, with the mimicry is really the result of people using these both networks is emotional and behavioral contagion.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling something inside, other people around you are going to pick it up. And here's the kicker, Clint, in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second.
Right.
Even if you're not aware that you're feeling it, even if you're not showing it on your face, other people around you are going to pick it up. So you literally, as we've talked about in the latest book, you literally are walking around infecting people. And this is all pre-COVID. You're infecting people either positively or negatively. And it turns out, in terms of neural aspects of it, there is no neutral. So nobody's neutral. If you say, well, do you feel positive or negative about it? You say, well, I'm neutral. That's bull. That means you're negative, but you don't want to say it. It could be mild negative, but it's still negative. So the issue is that all of us are hardwired to pick up on the emotions of others, except those people on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. They actually have a dysfunction in that, what I'm labeling, or Tony Jack labels, the empathic network.
Okay.
But that's less than 2% of the people,
Right.
we think.
I was going to ask this question later, but now I think it's a good time. So basically, is the emotional intelligence and our ability to pick up on these things, is it influenced at all or negatively impacted by being remote? Are there some things you only get when you're face to face?
Yes, it's influenced, and it's more like an amplification when you're face to face. So one of the things that's happened is a lot of people who weren't used to using Skype and now Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever these platforms are, have all of a sudden discovered that you can have pretty much an emotional check-in as long as you don't have, 25 people on whose pictures are on the screen. But, you and I are now on the computer. We're each large enough that we can see each other's facial expressions.
Right.
And I think that on the whole, that's true. There is a generational difference here. I remember talking to Gilahard Fouds, who runs the coaching operations for Cisco Systems. And she was saying, yeah, the younger folks are so likely to be using FaceTime and all these other WhatsApp, all these other social media live interactions, that they pick up most of anything you do, even if you were physically in the same room. It's just like when you talk on the telephone, you lose people's nonverbals.
Right.
When you talk email and Twitter and all those things are what's called alexithemic. They don't have any emotion ordinarily built into them. And that's why people often go toward the negative and say so many things that normally you'd never say when you're face to face with someone. Well, if you're actually physically face to face, you're going to pick up something else, which are pheromones, which are, I mean, this sounds a little weird, but it's the odors that you emanate as a person. Now, that we're not going to pick up over Zoom.
Sure.
But if you're very sensitive, if you've done a lot of Paul Ekman's facial recognition training, you're going to notice when a person's, the sides of their eyes. You'll notice if they're laughing, not by hearing the guffaws, but by seeing the eye muscles go in the right way. You'll notice if the person is really expressing some degree of disgust, because you'll notice they scrunch their nose.
Right.
Now, if you're in a Zoom meeting with 49 people, the icons are so small you can't see that.
No. And now face to face, even with the mask, you miss some of that too.
Right.
Yeah. You talked about you're infecting people with emotions, and I was quite happy to read about the fact that laughter and smiles are contagious, which I think is a nice positive thing. And there's even been studies that back that up.
Yes. Well, actually, it's one of my current doctoral students just got back from the National Association of Humor Researchers, because she's looking at humor, at a doctoral level in terms of how it facilitates people's relationships. See, we know from some of the more recent research in the last 5 years that, and actually I saw the 5th published study in 2009, so it's the last like 11 or 12 years, that laughter, joy, and playfulness helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is it's the psychophysiological system, the neurological and hormonal system, that is the only antidote to stress. And that was a point in our latest book, and actually even in the 2005 book, Resonant Leadership, is that people chase the wrong thing when they try to reduce the amount of stress in their lives. What you should be doing is trying to increase what we call renewal, which is it's an easier term to use for activation of the parasympathetic system. And when this research came out, it became very clear that laughter, joy, and playfulness activates this renewal system. That was very important. Not necessarily happiness. Happiness is a little bit of a mixed bag, but laughter, joy, and playfulness is clear. It has some gender and status implications in different cultures, but nonetheless, when a person laughs or enjoys something like that and is playful in a way which isn't derogatory, it sets off this process in which you're actually more open to learning and you're more open to other people.
Yeah, I read in Sherry Turkle's book, Reclaiming Conversation, that studies have shown that basically parts of the brain get activated when we make eye contact with each other. And now in Primal Leadership, I learned that laughter is the shortest distance between two people. So maybe there's something with this emotional stuff after all.
Well, spoken as an amazing discovery for a former engineer.
Whose job in life is to desperately not be Sheldon. That's what I want.
That's right. That's a good title of a book or even a song. Desperately.
Desperately, yeah. So a good laugh doesn't just happen in response to punchlines, and it doesn't just mean that was funny. It also says it can send a message that we're on the same wavelength and we get along. So I was really surprised to read, because when I think of laughter, of course, I think about laughing at a punchline, but throughout the book, you show examples of people where laughter just comes kind of organically, that's sending a message, basically.
Some of the most powerful instances are sitting in a meeting where somebody makes an observation that a lot of people were thinking, but says it out loud and everybody laughs. And that break is very important, because what that person has done has provided a hormonal break with the stress hormones. And the stress hormones literally close people's perception down. I mean, research was done by a group of psychologists actually in England, but in which they sprayed into people's noses epinephrine, which is a stress endocrine or hormone, or oxytocin, which is a renewal hormone. And where they were able to show that your peripheral vision changes dramatically. Okay, so you said you'd worked on aircraft carriers. If anybody's around pilots, they know their peripheral vision. Most other people don't. So your peripheral vision, as you know, is if you stare at a spot straight ahead, put your hands about one hand length out from your shoulders and keep moving your hands back, it's where you all of a sudden lose sight of them. You know, for
Right.
me right now, it's just under 180 degrees. I am in my 70s, but and so it decreases, but usually it's somewhere on 180, 100 degrees. Well, under the epinephrine spray, the stress, it went down to 30 degrees.
Wow.
You spray the oxytocin, goes back out to 180. So you start to realize that if a manager or a leader is sitting there and saying to their staff or their team, the competition surprised us. They're eating our lunch. I need you to think outside the box. Everybody in that room is defensively tensed. They can't see the box. That's why they can't think outside the box.
So that's where the tunnel vision comes from,
Yes,
then, I guess.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the tunnel vision happens in a lot of ways. I mean, one of my former doctoral students, Chris Case, who's been the dean at George Washington University, he's tenured full professor there, very impressive scholar as well as person. And he wrote a book a number of years ago and I remember he got first really interested in a seminar with me about this adventure consultant's attempt to reach the peak of Everest, in which most of them died.
Wow.
And one of my EMBA teams, decade and a half later, ended up comparing that expedition with Seinhauser's expedition. Seinhauser was blind, and he led an expedition to the summit of Everest. And one of the things that became very clear, which was the point of Chris's discovery in his book, is that these folks that so many of them died were not paying attention to what other people were saying. So, there are a number of base camps that you go when you climb Everest.
Right.
They were told at the last two base camps to turn around because this bad weather was socked in. They were, I think, something like 150 yards from the summit the last time they were told, turn around, go back. And they didn't. And I believe 16 out of the 19 people died.
Wow.
And they didn't die going up, they died coming down.
Okay.
Because they were so fixed on their goal, they weren't looking at what was going on around them. And I think that happens a lot in organizations.
Now, I have a colleague that's always joking that his personality matches his blood type. Of course, he's B positive. And we've all been around people that were fun and upbeat and others that were maybe dour and negative. But there's some research around the effects of positive leaders on retention, among other things, right?
Yes. Well, look, I shouldn't say right now, who knows right now, but pre-COVID, the engagement numbers were abysmal. 76% of the people who had full-time work in North America weren't engaged in their work. 83% in Europe, 81% in Japan. That says around the world, people who have full-time jobs, 4 out of 5 of them aren't bringing their stuff to work.
Wow.
The hell with talent management. It's not even showing up. Their
Right.
bodies may be, but their capability isn't. So very interesting question. If people are that not engaged, what's producing the loss of engagement? Or to put it the other way around, what produces increased engagement? Well, others have studied this as well, but I've supervised a number of my former doctoral students who've done studies that have been published showing that I did this one with engineers in one of the largest companies in the world, and half of the sample of engineers came from their German research division and half from the North American. And what became very clear was their engagement was dramatically, almost a third of their engagement, their feeling of engagement, was affected by their perception of a shared sense of purpose in their project teams. They're engineers and research, it's all done in projects. But
Right.
did they have a shared sense of purpose, which was not goals? This was really purpose, vision. One of my students we ended up publishing the paper together. Ed Mahan showed this, and Scott Taylor and I were on the publication that knowledge workers in manufacturing or in consulting companies, their engagement was a function of the amount of emotional intelligence that each of the team members showed behaviorally, and was amplified by the degree of shared vision. So all of a sudden, we realize that the quality of our relationships can amp up our individual capability because they make you want to use your talent. They engage you. And that's the issue. What we've found in the research is that when you take things that I call the positive emotional attractor, which are things that engage the parasympathetic, the renewal processes, engage the empathic network, and just make you feel positive about things, they are more likely to bring you up, to help you open up, and therefore you're more present, as they say in the mindfulness field. The other, the stress, the analytic, the negative, the criticism, all moves people into defensive posturing. They hunker down, they close down, and the result is, it's like, hey, that's not my job.
Right.
Like, why the hell would I do that? So we have measures, not in a lot of these studies, not just on engagement, but another variable studied in management scholar literature is called organizational citizenship, which is to what extent do you go beyond your job?
Right. Like the person who picks up trash in the parking lot on the way to the car, that's not their job, but they do it anyway, right?
Right.
Well, that concludes part one of my interview with Richard Boyatzis, a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University and author of 9 books, including Primal Leadership. Coming up in part 2 of our conversation, we'll discuss the importance of including brief renewal periods throughout the day to combat stress and achieve some significant benefits.
If people don't have a steady dose of brief periods, 10 to 15-minute periods of renewal throughout a day, you're burning up, not burning out, you're burning up. Even mild stress causes degrees of cognitive and emotional and perceptual impairment. If you balance each week the amount of renewal moments against the amount of stress moments, that basically you have higher sense of well-being, better job satisfaction, better life satisfaction, more empathy, more resilience, less anxiety, less depression, more engagement, all the things we're looking for.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at Amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.